Why our adopted bear sneaks into Lyra's bed every night. The first snow always came early to the Hartwell farm, dusting the weathered barn roof and the split rail fence that marked where civilization ended and the wilderness began. Lyra pressed her face against the kitchen window, watching the flakes spiral down in the amber glow of the porch light. Her breath fogged the glass, and she traced a small heart in the condensation before her mother's gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Come away from the window, sweetheart," Martha Hartwell said softly. "Your father will be in from the evening chores soon." Lyra turned without a word, her gray eyes holding that distant quality they'd carried for the past 18 months. The silence that had settled over her after the accident wasn't the comfortable quiet of a shy child, it was something deeper, more profound, as if words had simply ceased to matter in the language of her inner world. The doctors had said there was nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords after the tree branch had struck her during that terrible storm. After the 3 days she'd spent unconscious in the hospital, with her parents keeping vigil. But when she'd awakened, she'd looked at them with recognition and love, yet hadn't spoken a single word since. Her parents had learned to read the subtle communications in her expressions, the way she'd nod or shake her head, how she'd take their hands to lead them to what she needed. Sometimes Martha caught glimpses of the chattering 7-year-old Lyra had been, in the way her daughter's eyes would light up when she discovered a bird's nest or watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. But those moments felt like echoes of someone who had traveled very far away and wasn't quite ready to come home. The autumn that Lyra turned 9 brought an unusually early frost, and with it, a restlessness in the forest animals that bordered their property. James Hartwell had mentioned seeing more deer than usual venturing close to the house, and twice he'd found evidence of a black bear rummaging through their compost pile. On the afternoon that would change everything, he was repairing a section of the fence line when he heard Lyra's sharp intake of breath behind him. She stood motionless, about 20 feet away, her small frame silhouetted against the golden October light filtering through the maple trees. James followed her gaze to the edge of the forest, where something dark lay crumpled against the base of an old oak. At first he thought it might be a pile of discarded clothes or a bag that had blown in from the road, but as they approached together, Lyra's hand slipping into his with unusual urgency, he realized they were looking at a black bear cub. The animal couldn't have been more than a year old, its body curled in on itself in the universal posture of pain. Its breathing was shallow and labored, and James could see a gash along its right flank that looked like it had come from either a car strike or an encounter with a larger predator. Most children would have been frightened, would have instinctively stepped back or called out an alarm, but Lyra dropped his hand and walked forward with a confidence that both amazed and worried him. "Lyra, honey, you need to stay back," he said quietly, but she was already kneeling beside the cub, her small hand hovering just above its matted fur. The bear's eyes opened, dark, intelligent, and surprisingly calm for a wild animal in distress. Lyra looked back at her father, and in her expression he saw something he hadn't witnessed since before the accident, a spark of purpose, of connection to something outside her own careful silence. Martha met them halfway to the house, taking one look at the unconscious cub in James' arms and understanding immediately that their quiet daughter had made a decision for all of them. They cleared out the old tool shed that hadn't been used since James' father passed away, laying down fresh straw and setting up a makeshift pen with chicken wire. The local veterinarian, Dr. Reynolds, came out that evening and confirmed that the cub was likely orphaned, old enough to survive, but young enough to need care through the winter. "You'll want to contact Wildlife Services," he told them as he cleaned and stitched the wound. "They'll relocate him to a rehabilitation center once he's stable." But even as Dr. Reynolds spoke, James watched his daughter sitting cross-legged just outside the pen, her chin resting on her knees as she observed every detail of the bear's labored breathing. When the veterinarian left, she was still there, and when Martha came to check on them an hour later, she found Lyra had somehow gotten into the pen and was curled up beside the sleeping cub, one hand resting gently on its uninjured shoulder. "Lyra Rose Hartwell," Martha said, her voice carrying both exasperation and wonder, "you get out of there this instant." Lyra looked up at her mother, and for just a moment, Martha thought she might actually speak. Instead, her daughter shook her head with a quiet determination that suggested this was not a negotiation. The bear stirred slightly under her touch, its breathing seeming to even out, and Martha found herself backing down from an argument she hadn't expected to have. They named him Orrin, though Lyra never spoke the name aloud. It was Martha who suggested it, remembering her own grandfather, who had been known for his gentleness with animals and his ability to move through the forest without disturbing so much as a twig underfoot. The name seemed to fit the cub's particular quality of stillness, the way he watched the world with an alertness that spoke of ancient wisdom rather than mere animal instinct. Recovery came slowly. For the first week, Orrin barely moved except to drink the glucose water Dr. Reynolds had prescribed. But gradually, his appetite returned, and with it, a playful curiosity about his surroundings. He would bat at falling leaves that drifted into the pen or investigate the various objects Lyra brought him, a pine cone, a smooth riverstone, a piece of colorful fabric that caught his attention. What amazed James and Martha most was how comfortable Orrin seemed with Lyra's presence, how he would settle into a deeper sleep when she was near, as if her silence was exactly the kind of communication he understood. The mystery began on a Tuesday morning in November. Martha came out to the shed with breakfast for Orrin and found the pen empty, the carefully secured gate hanging open with no sign of how it had been unlatched. Panic swept through her as she called for James, imagining the cub lost in the forest, or worse, having wandered onto the county road, where morning commuters wouldn't be expecting wildlife. They found Lyra in her bedroom, still in her pajamas, deeply asleep beneath her grandmother's old striped quilt. Curled beside her on top of the covers was Orrin, his dark fur stark against the faded fabric, both of them breathing in the synchronized rhythm of peaceful dreams. The bedroom door was closed, and James was certain he had checked all the locks before bed the night before. "How did he get in here?" Martha whispered, but James could only shake his head in bewilderment. They decided not to wake either of them, instead sitting in the hallway with their morning coffee, taking turns checking on the impossible scene. When Lyra finally stirred around 8 o'clock, Orrin was gone, and she seemed as surprised as anyone to find herself alone in bed. The pattern repeated itself night after night. No matter how securely they fastened the shed, no matter how carefully they checked the doors and windows of the house, morning would find Lyra and Orrin together, sometimes in her bed, sometimes on the living room couch, once memorably in the loft of the barn, both of them nestled in the loose straw like they'd been there for hours. James began to wonder if he was losing his mind, if the stress of Lyra's continued silence was making him imagine things that couldn't possibly be happening. But it wasn't his imagination that brought the gifts. The first one appeared on a Wednesday in late November, placed carefully on Lyra's dresser while she was at school. It was one of her winter gloves, the left one from a pair she'd lost the previous spring during a family picnic at the state park. Martha found it there when she went to put away laundry, sitting precisely in the center of the dresser, as if it had been placed with great deliberation. "Did you find this somewhere, sweetheart?" she asked Lyra that evening, holding up the glove. Lyra examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands with an expression of wonder and confusion. She shook her head, but her eyes held a flicker of recognition, as if she was remembering not just the glove, but the moment she had lost it. More items followed over the weeks that preceded the first real snowfall. A hair ribbon that had blown away during a summer thunderstorm. A small drawing she'd made of their dog Rusty that had somehow disappeared from her art box months earlier. A handkerchief with her initials embroidered in blue thread, one of a set her grandmother had made for her before she passed away, and which Lyra had dropped somewhere in the woods behind their house during a nature walk with her father. Each item appeared in the same way, placed with care somewhere in Lyra's room or sometimes in the shed, where she spent her after-school hours with Orrin. James began to suspect their daughter was finding these things herself and simply not remembering, perhaps in the dreamy state between sleep and waking, where lost memories sometimes surface. But Martha noticed something else, the way Lyra would hold each recovered item, studying it with the intensity of someone trying to piece together a puzzle, and then carefully add it to a growing collection she was arranging in the corner of the shed. It wasn't random placement. Lyra had created a perfect circle using an old crate as a base, arranging each returned belonging with the precision of someone conducting a ritual. The hair ribbon was draped over a small piece of driftwood they'd brought back from a family vacation to the coast. The drawing was weighted down with a smooth riverstone, and the handkerchief was folded into a neat square beside the original glove. At the center of the circle, she had placed a candle stub that had burned down to almost nothing, its wick black and curled, but somehow still managing to hold a small, steady flame. Orrin seemed to understand the significance of this arrangement. He would circle it carefully when he was in the shed, never disturbing anything but always pausing to sniff delicately at each item, as if he was checking to make sure everything was as it should be. Sometimes Lyra would sit beside the circle with Orrin's head resting in her lap, both of them staring at the collection in a companionable silence that felt like the most natural form of communication in the world. Dr. Reynolds visited again in December, ostensibly to check on Orrin's progress but really because he was curious about the unusual arrangement James had described over the phone. The cub had grown significantly, his shoulders now reaching almost to Lyra's waist when he stood, and his coat had thickened into the glossy black fur of healthy adolescence. But what struck the veterinarian most was the quality of interaction between the girl and the bear. "I've never seen anything quite like it," he told James and Martha quietly, while Lyra and Orrin explored the snow-covered yard together. "She's not treating him like a pet, and he's certainly not behaving like a domesticated animal. It's more like..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Like they're having a conversation we can't hear." James nodded, understanding exactly what the doctor meant. There was something in the way Lyra would tilt her head when Orrin made one of his soft chuffing sounds, as if she was actually listening to what he was trying to tell her. And Orrin, despite his increasing size and strength, moved around her with a carefulness that suggested he was aware of her fragility in ways that went beyond the obvious physical differences between them. But Dr. Reynolds also brought news that James and Martha had been dreading. Wildlife Services had been asking questions about the unreported bear cub, and while he had been able to deflect their inquiry so far, spring would bring increased pressure to relocate Orrin to an official rehabilitation facility. "They're not wrong," he said gently. "As attached as Lyra is to him, and as gentle as he's been so far, he's still a wild animal. By next autumn he'll be nearly full-grown, and his instincts, well, they might override the bond he has with your daughter." That night, James found Lyra sitting in the shed with Orrin, both of them illuminated by the soft light of the oil lamp he'd hung from the rafters to keep the space from becoming too dark during the shorter days. She was showing Oren each item in her collection, holding them one by one as if she was telling him a story about where they had come from and how they had found their way back to her. The bear watched with the focused attention of someone receiving important information, occasionally nuzzling her hand or making one of his quiet rumbling sounds that seemed to serve as commentary or encouragement. James realized that his daughter was preparing for something, though he couldn't say exactly what. There was a sense of ceremony in her actions, a gravity that suggested she understood their time together was limited in ways that went beyond the practical concerns of housing a growing bear cub. When she finally looked up and saw him watching from the doorway, her expression held a sadness that was entirely too mature for her 9 years, as if she had accepted a loss that hadn't yet occurred. Christmas came and went quietly, with Oren receiving his own stocking filled with apples and honey-sweetened treats that Dr. Reynolds had assured them were safe for bears. Lyra had spent weeks working on a gift for him, a thick rope toy that she'd braided from old fabric scraps and sheep's wool. Oren carried it everywhere for days, occasionally bringing it to her as if asking for a game of gentle tug-of-war that always ended with both of them tumbling into the straw. Lyra's silent laughter expressing itself in the bright flush of her cheeks and the sparkle in her gray eyes. But January brought the first signs that their peaceful routine was beginning to change. James noticed it first, broken branches along the forest edge, stripped of bark in a pattern that suggested something large had been marking territory. Then came the morning when he found Oren huddled in the corner of the shed, a long scratch along his muzzle that definitely hadn't been there the night before. The cub seemed nervous, constantly looking toward the tree-line as if he was expecting something, and for the first time since his recovery, he showed little interest in the food Lyra brought him. "There's an adult bear somewhere nearby," Dr. Reynolds confirmed when he examined the scratch. "Probably a male, establishing territory before the mating season. Oren's getting old enough that he's being seen as either a rival or an intruder." The implications hung unspoken in the air. If a full-grown black bear was viewing their property as part of its territory, Oren's presence could escalate into a dangerous situation for all of them. But Lyra seemed to understand the threat in ways that the adults were only beginning to grasp. She started spending even more time in the shed, often falling asleep there despite her parents' gentle efforts to coax her back to her own bed. They would find her in the morning wrapped in the striped quilt, positioned between Oren and the door as if she was standing guard. The attacks began in February. Oren would disappear for hours at a time, returning with new injuries, scratches across his shoulders, a torn ear, once a limp that lasted for 3 days. Each time, Lyra would clean his wounds with a gentleness that spoke of practice, humming wordlessly under her breath in a melody that seemed to calm both of them. She had stopped arranging new items in her circle, instead sitting beside it each evening as if she was keeping vigil over something precious and fragile. It was during one of these extended absences that James made the discovery that explained, at least partially, how Oren had been moving through their secured house and property with such ease. While checking the foundation for winter damage, he found a series of loose boards under the back porch that had been carefully worked free, creating an opening large enough for a determined bear cub to squeeze through. The tunnel led to a network of old drainage pipes that connected to the storm cellar, and from there, access to the house would have been simple through the interior cellar door that they never bothered to lock. But even understanding the logistics didn't diminish the mystery of how Oren seemed to know exactly where to find Lyra, or how he had managed to locate her lost belongings in the vast expanse of forest that surrounded their property. James mentioned this to Martha as they watched their daughter sitting beside Oren in the afternoon sunshine, both of them focused on something in the distance that neither adult could see. "Maybe the how doesn't matter as much as the why," Martha said quietly. "Maybe some connections don't need explanations." The red paint appeared on a Tuesday in early March, bright as blood against the weathered wood of a broken branch that Oren carried back from one of his forest excursions. James recognized it immediately, the marking system used by the State Forestry Department to indicate trees tagged for removal or, in some cases, to mark areas where problem animals had been spotted. His stomach dropped as he realized what it meant. Someone had reported the bear activity, and official intervention was now only a matter of time. Oren's visits to the shed became increasingly sporadic after that. Sometimes he would be gone for 2 or 3 days at a time, returning exhausted and bearing new wounds that suggested the encounters with the adult bear were becoming more violent. Lyra stopped going to school, not through any decision by her parents, but because she seemed to sense that her time with Oren was running out and she couldn't bear to waste any of it in a classroom. Martha called her in sick and didn't argue when she found her daughter sleeping in the shed, maintaining a constant vigil that felt both protective and preparatory. Dr. Reynolds came by on a Thursday afternoon in mid-March, ostensibly to check on Oren's latest injuries but really to deliver news that James and Martha had been expecting. Wildlife Services had scheduled a capture and relocation for the following week. They had been more than patient given the circumstances, but the reports of bear activity in a residential area could no longer be ignored. "I know this is hard," he said gently, watching Lyra through the shed window as she carefully cleaned a gash on Oren's shoulder, "but it's the right thing for everyone, including him. He needs to learn to live wild, and staying here, it's not fair to either of them." That night, the first real snowstorm of late winter arrived with a ferocity that caught the Weather Service off guard. What had been predicted as light flurries became a full blizzard by midnight, with winds that rattled the windows and sent snow swirling in patterns that seemed to erase the familiar landmarks of their property. James checked on Lyra twice, finding her sound asleep in her own bed both times. But when he went out to the shed around 2 in the morning to make sure Oren was secure, he found the pen empty and the door hanging open in the wind. He called for Martha, and together they searched the house from top to bottom, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But Lyra was gone, and so was her heavy winter coat. The back door was unlocked, and in the swirling snow outside, they could just make out a single set of small footprints leading toward the forest before the wind erased them completely. The search began immediately despite the dangerous conditions. James grabbed his heaviest flashlight and emergency gear while Martha called the sheriff's department and Dr. Reynolds. Within an hour they had a dozen volunteers from the surrounding farms, all of them familiar with the terrain and the risks of being caught in the open during a blizzard. But the snow was falling too fast, and the wind was too strong for the search dogs to pick up a scent trail. And as the hours passed, the initial urgency began to shift into something that felt increasingly like desperation. Lyra found Oren nearly a mile into the forest, collapsed beneath the spreading branches of an enormous pine tree that provided just enough shelter to keep him from being completely buried in the accumulating snow. He was barely conscious when she reached him, his breathing shallow and labored, and she could see dark patches in his fur that could only be blood. But it wasn't until she knelt beside him that she realized he wasn't alone. Pressed against his belly, barely visible in the swirling snow, was another bear cub, this one much smaller than Oren, with pale gray fur and eyes that were barely open. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, and its tiny body was trembling with cold despite the warmth Orrin was providing with his own failing strength. Lyra understood immediately what had happened. Orrin had found an orphaned cub, probably the victim of the same adult male who had been attacking him, and had used the last of his strength to carry it to safety. She wrapped her winter coat around the smaller cub, feeling its heartbeat flutter against her chest like a trapped bird. Then she pressed her forehead against Orrin's muzzle, feeling his warm breath on her face, and for the first time in 18 months, words came back to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but clear in the stillness beneath the pine boughs. "Thank you for bringing him to me." Orrin's eyes opened one last time, meeting hers with a clarity that spoke of understanding and acceptance. Then his breathing slowed, deepened, and finally stopped altogether, leaving only the soft sounds of the wind and the faint mewing of the cub in Lyra's arms. The rescue team found them 3 hours later, following the intermittent signal from the emergency whistle James had insisted Lyra carry ever since the accident. She was sitting with her back against the pine tree, the gray cub wrapped in her coat and held securely against her chest, her other hand resting on Orrin's still form. She was hypothermic and exhausted, but alert enough to resist when they tried to separate her from the cub. "He's mine now," she said clearly, her first complete sentence in more than a year. "Orrin brought him to me." The recovery took several days, during which the gray cub, whom Lyra never named, but whom everyone began to simply call Little Bear, remained constantly at her side. Unlike Orrin, this bear seemed to understand from the beginning that his place was temporary, that Lyra was caring for him but not keeping him. He was more reserved, more traditionally wild in his responses to the human world around him, but he accepted her care with a patience that suggested he understood the debt he owed to both her and the bear who had saved his life. Dr. Reynolds examined Little Bear thoroughly and pronounced him healthy but definitely orphaned, probably no more than 4 months old, based on his size and development. Under normal circumstances, he would have recommended immediate placement in a wildlife rehabilitation center, but Lyra's continued silence on any topic except the bear's welfare, combined with her parents' reluctance to force another separation so soon after losing Orrin, convinced him to allow a temporary arrangement. Just through the winter, he told James and Martha privately. Come spring, he'll need to go to a facility that can teach him proper foraging and survival skills. What happened with Orrin, it was special. But it wasn't natural. This little one needs to learn to be a wild bear. Lyra seemed to understand this instinctively. Her care for Little Bear was tender but not possessive, focused on his immediate needs rather than on creating the kind of deep emotional bond she had shared with Orrin. She fed him, kept him warm, and gradually introduced him to the elements of bear behavior that Orrin had never needed to learn in captivity. She would take him to the edge of the forest during the day, encouraging him to climb low trees and investigate the smells and sounds of his natural habitat, always staying close but never interfering with his exploration. The circle of belongings in the shed remained untouched through the winter months, but Lyra began to change its arrangement as the weather grew warmer. Instead of a perfect circle, she created a half-moon shape, leaving space as if she were expecting someone to complete the pattern. She moved the striped quilt to the center of the arrangement, and Little Bear would sometimes nap there in the afternoon sunshine that streamed through the shed's open door. But he never claimed it the way Orrin had claimed every space he occupied. By early April, Little Bear had grown significantly and was showing increasing restlessness. During their daily trips to the forest edge, he would venture farther from Lyra each time, staying away for longer periods before returning to check on her location. Dr. Reynolds confirmed what they all could see: he was ready to begin the transition to independent life, and delaying it much longer would be unfair to his development. The morning of his departure arrived with the kind of golden spring sunshine that made everything seem possible. Lyra completed her arrangement in the shed, placing the striped quilt in the center of the half-moon circle and setting out each of her recovered belongings in precise positions around it. Little Bear watched from the doorway, then walked carefully into the space, sniffing each item as Oren had done months earlier. He lay down on the quilt for several minutes, his gray fur stark against the faded stripes, as if he were memorizing something important. Then he stood, walked to where Lyra waited by the door, and pressed his muzzle briefly against her hand, the first and only time he had initiated physical contact with her. Without looking back, he walked across the yard, through the gap in the fence line, and disappeared into the forest that had always been his true home. Lyra stood on the porch for a long time, watching the tree line where he had vanished. When she finally came inside, Martha expected to find her crying. But instead, her daughter's face held the same peaceful acceptance she had shown during her vigil with Oren. That evening, she spoke for the second time since the accident, asking simply if they could leave the shed door open in case Little Bear wanted to visit. But Little Bear never returned. And as the days passed into weeks, Lyra seemed to understand that he wasn't meant to. The striped quilt disappeared from her bed, and Martha found it folded neatly in the center of the arrangement in the shed, as if Lyra had left it there as an offering or a memorial. The shed door remained propped open, and gradually, small animals began to use it as a shelter: field mice, a family of chipmunks, once a young fox that stayed for 3 days before moving on. The miracle revealed itself on a morning in late May, when James went to the shed to retrieve some gardening tools. Where the quilt had been, a small sapling had somehow pushed its way up through the packed earth floor, its tender green leaves catching the early sunlight that streamed through the open door. The tree was barely a foot tall, but it was thriving despite the lack of proper soil. And on one of its lower branches, caught as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a scrap of blue fabric that James recognized as part of one of Lyra's old handkerchiefs. He called Martha and Lyra to see, and the three of them stood in the doorway, staring at something that should have been impossible. No one had planted anything in the shed, the earth floor had been packed solid for decades. And yet here was a young tree, growing with the kind of vigorous health that suggested it had been there much longer than the few weeks since Little Bear's departure. "How did this get here?" Martha asked. But Lyra just smiled, the first genuine smile they had seen since before the accident. "Oren," she said simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. The tree grew throughout the summer, defying every logical explanation for its existence, but thriving nonetheless. Lyra tended it carefully, watering it during dry spells and protecting its tender trunk from curious animals. By autumn, it had doubled in height, and the scrap of fabric had weathered to a soft gray that seemed to blend with the changing colors of the forest beyond their property. Dr. Reynolds visited one last time before the first anniversary of Oren's death, ostensibly to check on Lyra's continued recovery, but really because he was curious about the stories he'd been hearing from James about their impossible tree. When he saw it for himself, growing strong and healthy in conditions that should have killed it within days, he simply shook his head and smiled. "Some things don't need explanations," he said, echoing Martha's words from the year before. "Sometimes the mystery is the point." Lyra nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had learned that some connections transcend the boundaries of life and death, that love can take forms that don't require words or even physical presence. The tree was proof that Oren's gift to her had been more than companionship. It had been the restoration of her faith in the possibility of wonder, in the reality of bonds that exist beyond human understanding. As the leaves began to turn and the first hints of winter appeared in the morning air, Lyra would sometimes sit beside the tree in the early evening, watching the forest where two bears had taught her that silence could be its own form of communication, and that sometimes the most profound conversations happened without words. The tree rustled softly in the wind, and in that sound, she heard the echo of a gentle chuffing that reminded her that some friendships are written in a language that time cannot erase.